There are things you can explain, there are things you can analyze until every detail has been separated, examined, understood, and placed exactly where it belongs. And then there are things that refuse to be explained, not because they are confusing, because they are too precise, too deeply woven into the way you experience something to be reduced to a simple reason. That is what this has become. I keep trying to find the beginning of it, as though somewhere behind us there must be a specific moment that explains everything that came afterward. A sentence, a look, a conversation, a silence that lasted slightly longer than it should have, something. Anything that would allow me to point to one place and say, there, that was when it changed. But every time I look for that moment, I find something different. A collection of small things, things that seemed insignificant when they happened, things I could have dismissed individually, but together they created something I can no longer pretend wasn't there. That is the strange part. Nothing happened loudly. There was no dramatic entrance, no obvious declaration, no moment where everything suddenly became clear. Instead, something gradual happened without ever feeling gradual. It was almost as though the distance between us disappeared before either of us noticed it was disappearing. And by the time I became aware of it, you weren't standing at the edge of my world anymore. You were somewhere inside it. I don't know when you moved there. I don't know how you got past all the places where I usually stop people. I only know that somehow you did. And what makes that difficult to accept is that I didn't feel invaded. I didn't feel pressured. I didn't feel like something had been taken from me. I felt recognized. And there is a difference between being seen and being recognized. Being seen as external, someone notices your expressions, your words, your habits, the things you reveal, but recognition reaches somewhere else. It happens when another person notices the structure underneath all of that, the way you arrive at conclusions, the way you disappear into thought, the way you become quiet when something matters too much to say carelessly, the way you protect certain parts of yourself without announcing that you're protecting them, the way you can be surrounded by people and still remain somewhere entirely internal. Most people see the behavior, you seem to notice the reason behind it. And I didn't know what to do with that. At first, I tried to make it ordinary. I told myself you were observant, that you simply paid attention, that perhaps I was assigning meaning to things because I wanted there to be meaning. That explanation was easier, safer. It allowed me to put everything back into its proper category. But then it happened again and again and again, different moments, different circumstances. The same strange accuracy. You would notice something I hadn't said. You would respond to something I hadn't explained. You would understand a silence I hadn't intended to make meaningful. And eventually, I had to stop calling it coincidence, because coincidence can happen once, maybe twice, but repetition creates a pattern, and patterns ask to be acknowledged. That's when I started paying attention to you differently, not because I was searching for something, because I was trying to understand why you kept appearing in places where I hadn't expected you to exist. You were becoming part of my internal reference system. Something would happen, and I would think about how you might see it. I would hear someone say something and wonder whether you would notice the same detail I noticed. I would reach a conclusion, and before I had even finished forming it, there would be this strange internal pause, as though another perspective had entered the room, yours even when you weren't there. That was when I realized this had changed. Because thinking about someone is simple. People think about people all the time, memories, conversations, possibilities, regrets, curiosity. But thinking with someone is different. Thinking with someone means their way of seeing things has become part of the machinery of your own mind. It means their presence doesn't require their physical presence anymore. It means they have become a reference point, a quiet one, almost invisible, but always there. And I don't know when you became that for me. I don't know when your perspective became something my mind automatically considered. I only know that one day I noticed it, and once I noticed it, I couldn't unknow it. That realization made me uncomfortable. Not because I disliked it, because I couldn't control it. And control has always mattered to me. I've always understood the value of distance. Distance gives you perspective. Distance gives you choices. Distance allows you to decide what someone knows and what they don't. It lets you control access. It lets you remain partially unreadable. And being unreadable can be useful. When people don't fully understand you, they can't easily reshape you. They can't easily define you. They can't decide what you are based on the parts they happen to see. So I learned to live with layers. Not fake versions, not lies, just layers. Different people receive different amounts of access. Some people know the surface, some know the habits, some know the history. Very few ever reach the internal place where the reasons live. And I was comfortable with that until you didn't seem interested in collecting information about me. You weren't trying to solve me. That would have been easier to resist. People who try to solve you reveal themselves quickly. They ask questions because they want answers. They search for patterns because they want certainty. They categorize because categories make people easier to understand. But you didn't seem to need a category. You allowed things to remain unfinished. You could notice something without forcing it into a conclusion. You could hear silence without demanding that it become speech. And somehow, that made me more visible than questions ever could, because I didn't feel examined. I felt witnessed. There is something disarming about being witnessed without being judged. It removes the need to perform. It removes the instinct to prepare an explanation. It creates a strange kind of stillness where you don't have to become easier to understand. You can simply exist, and somehow that became possible around you. I started noticing things about myself that I hadn't noticed before, not because you pointed them out, because your presence created enough space for me to see them. That's an important distinction. You didn't change me. You made certain things impossible for me to keep overlooking. And that is much more powerful because when someone changes you, you can blame them. You can say they influenced you. You can say they persuaded you. You can say you became different because of them. But when someone reveals something that was already inside you, there is nowhere to place the responsibility. You have to look at yourself. And that is what this connection has forced me to do. Look inward. Not romantically, not dramatically, just honestly. I've had to ask myself why your presence feels familiar, why your silence doesn't feel empty, why conversations with you seem to continue even after they end, why certain thoughts feel incomplete until I imagine how you might interpret them. Why I can remember something you said long after I've forgotten conversations that were objectively more important. Why some moments with you feel strangely larger than the moment itself. I don't have simple answers. Maybe there aren't any. Maybe some people simply meet at the right psychological frequency. Maybe two minds can recognize similar structures without sharing the same history. Maybe familiarity doesn't always require time. Maybe sometimes it comes from similarity. Not similarity in personality, not in circumstances, not even in beliefs. Something deeper. The way two people process uncertainty, the way they observe before speaking, the way they protect what matters, the way they experience silence, the way they recognize things without needing to announce that they've recognized them. Maybe that's what happened. Maybe somewhere beneath everything visible, something matched. And when it matched, neither of us had to force anything. It simply became noticeable. That's why I don't want to call this intensity. Intensity comes and goes. It rises, it burns, it demands, then it disappears. This isn't like that. This is quieter. And somehow, quieter things can become more permanent. They don't announce themselves loudly enough to be questioned. They simply become part of your routine, part of your thinking, part of the way you interpret ordinary moments. That is what happened here. You became ordinary in the strangest possible way. Not because you became less important, because your presence stopped feeling unusual. It became natural. And natural things are often the hardest to recognize as extraordinary. You don't wake up every morning and marvel at the fact that you breathe. You don't constantly question the existence of gravity. You simply live inside those realities. And somewhere along the way, I started living with the reality of you without making a decision about it, without announcing it, without even fully admitting it. You were simply there, in the background, in the spaces between thoughts, in the questions I didn't ask, in the conclusions I hadn't spoken, and eventually I realized that the absence of your presence would now be noticeable. That scared me because I know what it means when something becomes noticeable through absence. It means it has already taken up space, and I don't give space easily. I don't leave doors open without knowing why. I don't let people become important accidentally. At least, I didn't think I did. But maybe importance isn't something you grant. Maybe sometimes it happens before permission. Maybe the mind recognizes what matters before the conscious self is ready to admit it. That's what I think happened. Some part of me understood before the rest of me caught up. And now I'm standing in the aftermath of a decision I don't remember making. You matter there. That's the sentence I kept avoiding. Not because it is dramatic, because it is simple. You matter. And once something that's simple becomes true, everything around it changes. You begin to notice what you would lose. You begin to notice what you would miss. You begin to notice which silences would feel different if they were permanent. You begin to understand why certain connections are worth protecting. And protection doesn't always mean holding on. Sometimes it means being honest about what something is. Sometimes it means refusing to manipulate it into becoming something easier. Sometimes it means allowing it to exist without forcing it toward an outcome. I don't know what this is supposed to become. And for once, I'm not sure I need to know yet. That may be the biggest change in me. I have always wanted definitions. Definitions create boundaries. Boundaries create control. Control creates safety. But this connection has taught me something uncomfortable. Not everything meaningful becomes safer when you define it. Sometimes definition can be a form of reduction. You take something complicated and force it into a word: friendship, love, cons, familiarity, trust. and suddenly you feel like you've understood it. But the word isn't the thing. The word is only a container. And some things are too large for the container you give them. Maybe that's why I resisted naming this. Not because I was afraid of what it might be, because I was afraid of making it smaller. There are connections that don't need immediate labels. They need honesty. They need boundaries. They need mutual understanding. They need time. And perhaps most importantly, they need reality, because it is easy to create a powerful connection inside your own mind. Much harder to know whether the other person experiences anything similar. That distinction matters, and I know it. Whatever I feel, whatever I recognize, whatever meaning I assign to this, I cannot automatically make it a shared truth. I can only speak for what has changed inside me, and something has changed. That much is undeniable. You made me more aware of my own internal world. You made me question the distance I once considered permanent. You made me realize that being understood doesn't necessarily mean losing yourself. Sometimes being understood allows you to stop defending yourself. That is different. And maybe that's what I was missing. I thought closeness meant exposure. I thought letting someone see you meant giving up control. But perhaps the right kind of understanding doesn't take control away. Perhaps it gives you the freedom to stop exercising it every second. That's what your presence did. It gave me moments where I didn't have to manage how I was being perceived. I didn't have to calculate every word. I didn't have to prepare every silence. I didn't have to make myself more understandable. I could simply be. And strangely enough, that made me want to be more honest. Not because you demanded honesty, because I no longer saw the point in hiding behind unnecessary complexity. There is something exhausting about constantly translating yourself, explaining why you are quiet, why you disappear, why you need space, why you don't respond immediately, why you think too much, why certain things affect you more than you show, why you care about things you pretend not to care about. Most people want explanations because explanations make them comfortable. You seemed comfortable with uncertainty, and that gave me room to exist without defending every part of myself. I began to understand why your presence felt different. You weren't trying to enter my world. You were simply standing close enough to notice it. And because you weren't forcing the door, I stopped feeling the need to lock it. That's the paradox. The more someone tries to get close, the more I want distance. The less someone demands access, the more naturally access becomes possible. You didn't ask me to open up. You didn't insist that I explain myself. You didn't make my silence a problem. And because you didn't require anything from it, my silence became something I could share. That's rare. Most people treat silence as absence. With you, silence became communication, not because every silence contains a hidden message, but because neither of us seemed afraid of it. We could let a moment remain unfinished. And unfinished things are usually where I feel most exposed, because there is no script, no expected response, no obvious direction. You simply have to stay. And somehow, staying became enough. I think that's what changed the meaning of your presence. You didn't make yourself important through grand gestures. You became important through consistency, through the accumulation of small recognitions, through moments that would have been forgettable with anyone else, through the strange feeling that I didn't have to explain every layer before you could understand the outline. And maybe that's why I remember the smallest things. Not because they were extraordinary, because they were accurate, a particular pause, a certain response. A moment where you noticed something without making a performance out of noticing it. Those moments mattered because they told me something. They told me that I didn't have to be loud to be seen. And perhaps I had been waiting for that without realizing it. There are parts of a person that don't ask to be understood. They simply hope that if someone ever sees them, that person won't misunderstand them. That is different. Understanding is expansive. Misunderstanding can be invasive. You can be seen clearly and still be understood incorrectly. That's why I have always valued precision. Not because I need people to agree with me, because I need them to see what is actually there. And you did, or at least you came closer than most. That distinction matters too. I don't want to romanticize something simply because it feels meaningful. I don't want to turn recognition into destiny. I don't want to mistake familiarity for certainty. Some connections feel profound and still aren't meant to become permanent. Some people arrive to reveal something and then leave. Some relationships transform you without lasting in the form you expected. I know that, and maybe knowing it is what makes this feel more real. Because I'm not trying to turn you into a conclusion. I'm trying to understand what your presence has already changed. That is enough. For now. There is a strange kind of courage in not forcing an answer, in allowing something to exist without immediately demanding that it become a future. I am learning that, slowly, because my instinct is still to analyze, to predict, to calculate, to ask where this leads. But perhaps the better question isn't where it leads. Perhaps the better question is what it is teaching me while it exists, and it is teaching me that I can be known without being reduced, that I can be close without disappearing into someone else, that I can allow another person to matter without surrendering my identity, that I can acknowledge connection without turning it into dependence, that I can care without needing to possess, that I can remain myself while allowing someone else to become significant. Those are not small lessons, and I don't think I would have learned them without you. You didn't teach them intentionally. You probably didn't even realize you were teaching them. That's another thing about impact. The person who changes something inside you doesn't always know they've done it. Sometimes they are simply themselves. And that is enough. You were yourself. And somehow, that was enough to make me question parts of myself I had stopped examining. Maybe that's why I keep returning to the same realization. This connection didn't feel like something being added to my life. It felt like something being uncovered, as though there had been a room inside me that had always existed, but I had never turned the light on, and somehow your presence made me look toward it. I don't know what's inside that room yet. Maybe fear, maybe hope, maybe vulnerability, maybe a version of myself I had kept hidden even from myself. But I know I can see the doorway now. And once you see a doorway, pretending there isn't one becomes difficult. That is what you changed. You made certain possibilities visible, not promises. Possibilities. And there is a difference. A possibility is not an outcome. It is simply evidence that something could exist. Maybe that's all this needs to be right now. A possibility, a connection that exists. A recognition that neither of us has to force into a final form. Because sometimes the most honest thing you can do with something meaningful is to let it breathe. Don't suffocate it with expectations. Don't burden it with fantasies. Don't demand certainty from something that is still becoming. Just pay attention. That's what I'm doing now. Paying attention to what happens when I don't run, to what happens when I don't overanalyze, to what happens when I allow the connection to be what it is without trying to make it prove itself. And the answer has surprised me. Nothing breaks. The world doesn't collapse. I don't lose myself. I simply become more aware of you, more aware of myself, more aware of the space between us. And maybe that awareness is enough to tell me that this matters, not because it has to become something enormous, but because it has already become something real. Reality doesn't always arrive with certainty. Sometimes it arrives as repetition, as consistency, as a feeling that remains after the excitement disappears, as something that still makes sense when you stop trying to make it impressive. That's what this feels like. Not impressive, not dra- not dramatic, just true to the experience. And truth doesn't need decoration. It needs acknowledgement. So let me acknowledge something I have been avoiding. I notice you more than I expected. I notice the way you think, the way you respond, the way you leave certain things unsaid. I notice the things you probably assume no one notices. I notice the difference between what you say and what you mean. I notice when you're present and when you're somewhere else internally. And I don't say that because I think I know everything about you. I don't. I couldn't. No one can completely know another person. There are rooms inside every human being that remain private. And perhaps that is healthy. Maybe being understood doesn't mean being completely exposed. Maybe it means having someone who can recognize the shape of what you don't say without demanding entry into every locked room. That's what I want to offer you. Not certainty that I know you completely, but honesty that I see you. And I see enough to know that there is something here worth respecting, worth protecting, worth not turning into a game, worth not reducing to a temporary feeling, because whatever this becomes, I don't want it to become artificial. I don't want us to start performing the connection because we have named it. I don't want every interaction to become evidence. I don't want silence to become a test. I don't want distance to become punishment. I don't want closeness to become obligation. I want the same thing that made this meaningful in the first place. Freedom. The freedom to be present, the freedom to be quiet, the freedom to speak, the freedom to step back when necessary, the freedom to return without pretending nothing happened. Because real connection shouldn't require the destruction of individuality. It should make individuality safer. That's what I think this has done. It has made me more myself. And perhaps that is the clearest sign that something matters. If someone enters your life and you become smaller, be careful. If someone enters your life and you become dependent on their approval, be careful. If someone enters your life and you stop knowing who you are without them, be careful. But if someone enters your life and somehow makes you more honest with yourself, more aware of your own mind, more willing to confront what you've avoided, pay attention. That doesn't automatically mean forever, but it means something. And I have been paying attention for longer than I admitted. There were moments when I could have stepped away. Maybe I should have. Maybe distance would have been easier. Maybe if I had ignored the feeling of familiarity early enough, it would have disappeared, but it didn't. Instead, it became quieter and deeper, which is almost more difficult to resist, because loud things can be rejected. Quiet things become habits, and you became a habit of awareness. Not an obsession, not a need, just a recurring presence in the architecture of thought. And architecture matters, because once something becomes structural, removing it isn't as simple as deleting a thought. You have to rebuild around the absence, and I'm not sure I want to rebuild. That doesn't mean I know what I want instead. It means I'm finally admitting that the old structure isn't completely accurate anymore. There is space for you now. That space exists whether I acknowledge it or not. And perhaps I don't need to fear that. Perhaps space doesn't always mean surrender. Sometimes space simply means possibility. A place where another person can exist without replacing anything. You don't have to replace anyone. You don't have to become everything. You don't have to carry a role you never asked for. You simply have to be yourself. That was enough before. It is enough now. And if anything changes, it should change because two people choose it honestly. Not because one person projected a future onto the other. Not because silence was mistaken for a promise. Not because recognition was mistaken for certainty. I want this to remain grounded because something can be profound without becoming fantasy. Something can be rare without being destiny. Something can matter without needing to consume everything else. Maybe that is the maturity this connection requires. Not more intensity, more clarity, not more closeness, more honesty, not more promises, more presence. And if there is one thing I have learned from all of this, it is that presence can be more powerful than explanation. You don't always need to say, I understand you. Sometimes the way you stay says it. You don't always need to say, I see you. Sometimes the way you remember small things says it. You don't always need to say, you matter. Sometimes the fact that you keep showing up says it. That is why actions still matter more than beautiful interpretations, because words can create entire worlds that reality never supports. I don't want that. I want whatever this is to survive contact with reality. I want it to remain meaningful when the conversations aren't perfect, when misunderstandings happen, when one of us is tired, when attention is elsewhere, when life becomes complicated, when there is nothing poetic happening. That's when we find out what something actually is. Not in the moments that feel extraordinary, in the ordinary ones. And I think that's where my trust in this comes from. Not because every moment has been perfect, because something has remained, the recognition, the ease, the strange familiarity, the sense that neither of us has to constantly perform. That is what I trust. Not an imagined future, not a promise, a pattern. And patterns matter because they reveal what remains when emotion changes. The more I think about it, the more I realize that perhaps I wasn't afraid of you. I was afraid of what your presence revealed about me. I was afraid of realizing that I could still be surprised, that I could still encounter someone who bypassed the defenses I thought were permanent, that I could still feel understood without having to explain every part of myself, that I could still make room. I had convinced myself that my internal world was complete, closed, stable, self-contained, and then you appeared, not as a disruption, as evidence that something in me was still unfinished. That is not a weakness. It is simply human. No matter how much we understand ourselves, we remain capable of discovering new dimensions through other people. Sometimes another person becomes a mirror, not the kind that shows you your appearance, the kind that shows you your patterns, your contradictions, your fears, your capacity for connection, your ability to care, your ability to remain yourself while letting someone matter. You became that kind of mirror, and I don't know whether you intended to, probably not, but intention isn't always required for impact. Sometimes existence is enough. Sometimes being yourself in front of someone else creates an encounter neither person could have planned. And that's what this feels like: unplanned, unforced, unexplainably precise. I keep thinking about the phrase, too much, too much recognition, too much familiarity, too much accuracy, too much ease. But maybe that's the wrong way to describe it. Maybe it isn't too much. Maybe it is simply more than I was accustomed to. And unfamiliar doesn't mean dangerous. It only means unfamiliar. I am learning that too. Not everything I cannot control is something I need to control. Not every unknown needs to be solved. Not every meaningful thing needs a guaranteed ending. Some things deserve to be experienced honestly while they are happening. That doesn't mean abandoning judgment. It means allowing judgment to coexist with openness. I can recognize the risks and still recognize the value. I can protect myself without pretending I feel nothing. I can maintain boundaries without building walls. I can care without losing myself. I can let you matter without making you responsible for my happiness. Those distinctions matter, and perhaps they are what make this sustainable. Because if something is going to remain meaningful, it cannot depend on illusion. It has to survive truth, the truth that we are separate people, the truth that we have separate lives, the truth that neither of us can read the other's mind, the truth that misunderstandings will happen, the truth that sometimes one person may feel more than the other, the truth that circumstances can change, the truth that even the strongest connections can take different forms. None of that makes the connection meaningless. It makes it real. And reality is what I want. Not perfection, reality. I don't need you to be exactly what I imagined. I don't need you to respond exactly the way I would. I don't need you to mirror every thought. In fact, maybe the differences are part of what makes the recognition interesting. You don't have to be me. You don't have to think like me in every way. You only have to understand enough of the structure underneath to recognize something familiar. That is different from sameness, and perhaps that's why this works. There is enough similarity for recognition, enough difference for curiosity, enough distance for individuality, enough closeness for honesty. That balance is rare, and perhaps that's why I don't want to rush it. I don't want to destroy something delicate by demanding that it become certain too quickly. There are things that grow better when you don't constantly measure them. You don't pull a plant out of the ground every week to check whether its roots are growing. You water it, you give it light, you protect it when necessary, and then you let it become what it is capable of becoming. Maybe connections need the same patience. Maybe this does too. So, I am not going to pretend I know the ending. I don't I don't know whether this becomes a permanent part of both our lives. I don't know whether it remains exactly as it is. I don't know whether it transforms into something deeper or eventually becomes a meaningful chapter we remember differently years from now. I don't know. And strangely, I'm beginning to believe that not knowing is okay, because what matters right now is that I am no longer pretending it doesn't exist. That's the change. Before, I could hide behind uncertainty. I could say, maybe I'm imagining it. Maybe it's coincidence. Maybe it doesn't mean anything. Now I understand that even if I cannot define the connection, I can acknowledge its effect, and its effect has been real. You have changed the way I listen. You have changed the way I notice. You have changed the way I understand silence. You have changed the way I think about closeness. You have changed the way I understand my own boundaries. And perhaps, most importantly, you've changed the way I think about being known. I used to think being known was dangerous. Now I think being misunderstood is what I fear more, because being known by the right person doesn't necessarily expose you. It can protect you from having to constantly explain yourself. That is a different kind of safety. And I felt glimpses of it with you. Maybe that's why I kept returning. Not because I needed you, because I recognized something I didn't want to lose, simply because I was afraid of what it meant. There is a difference between needing and choosing. Need says, I cannot be okay without you. Choice says, I am okay within myself, and I still want you here. I want the second. If you are ever part of my life in a deeper way, I want it to be because two whole people chose each other, not because two incomplete people tried to use each other to become whole. You are not responsible for completing me. I am not responsible for completing you. But perhaps we can reveal parts of each other that were difficult to see alone. Perhaps we can challenge each other without trying to change each other. Perhaps we can understand without owning. Perhaps we can stay without trapping. That would be enough, more than enough, because I don't want a connection that requires me to disappear, and I don't want to become the reason you disappear either. I want something that gives both people more room to become themselves. That is what I mean when I say you changed me. You didn't make me someone else. You made me notice myself more clearly, and perhaps that is the deepest kind of impact another person can have, not transformation into a different person. Recognition of the person you already were. There are parts of me I had forgotten existed. The softer parts, the curious parts, the parts that don't always need certainty, the parts that can sit beside someone in silence without trying to solve the silence. You brought those parts closer to the surface, and I don't resent you for that. I think I needed it. Maybe I had been too focused on maintaining structure, too focused on preventing disruption, too focused on making sure nothing reached deeply enough to change anything. But life isn't static. People aren't static. And maybe stability isn't the absence of change. Maybe stability is knowing that you can change without losing yourself. That's something I understand differently now. I can allow something to matter and still remain grounded. I can let someone affect me and still make my own decisions. I can acknowledge connection and still protect reality. I can feel deeply without surrendering judgment. That is where I am now, not lost, not consumed, aware. And perhaps that is why this doesn't scare me the way it used to, because I finally understand that acknowledging something doesn't mean giving it control. I can say, this matters, and still choose what happens next. I can say, I see you, and still allow you to remain free. I can say, you've reached a place inside me, and still understand that what happens from here requires both of us. That is the difference between recognition and possession. Recognition says, I see what this is doing to me. Possession says, therefore it belongs to me. I don't want possession, I want understanding. And maybe that's why I can finally speak about this without needing to turn it into a declaration, because a declaration creates expectation. This is something else. It is an acknowledgement, a quiet one, but honest. You became important. You became familiar. You became part of how I think. And I didn't plan any of it. But I don't need to apologize for it. I don't need to explain it away. I don't need to turn it into something less meaningful just because meaningful things make me uncomfortable. Some things are allowed to matter. Some people are allowed to reach you. Some connections are allowed to change your internal landscape. That doesn't make you weak. It makes you alive. And perhaps That's what I had forgotten. I was so focused on protecting myself from being changed that I forgot change isn't always damage. Sometimes change is expansion. Sometimes someone enters your awareness and doesn't take anything away. They simply create more room, more perspective, more questions, more possibilities, more honesty. That's what you did. You expanded something. I don't know exactly what, but I know the space is larger now, and I don't want to shrink it again just because the size of it makes me uncomfortable. So if there is one thing I can finally say without hesitation, it is this. I am no longer trying to figure out whether you matter. You do. The question is no longer whether this exists. It does. The question is not whether I noticed it. I did. The question is not whether it changed me. It has. The question now is how honestly I can live with that truth. And maybe that is where the real story begins, not in recognition, not in the first moment of familiarity, not in the strange alignment that brought us here, but in what we choose after realizing it, because recognition can happen accidentally. Choice cannot. Choices requires awareness, and I have that now. I know what this means to me. I know that your presence has become part of my internal landscape. I know that I see certain things differently because you exist in my awareness. I know that some silences feel different because I have experienced them with you. I know that certain conversations stay longer than they should. I know that I have made room, and I know that I didn't make that room carelessly. So whatever happens next, I don't want it to be accidental anymore. Not because I need to control it, because I want to participate in it consciously. There is a difference. I don't want to simply drift into something and wake up one day wondering how it became important. I want to be present enough to know if we move closer, I want it to be because we both choose it. If we remain where we are, I want that to be honest too. If life changes the shape of this, I want to accept that without pretending the connection never mattered. Because meaningful things don't become meaningless just because they change. A song doesn't become less beautiful because it ends. A season doesn't become less real because it passes. A conversation doesn't become worthless because it eventually becomes a memory. Meaning isn't measured by permanence alone. Sometimes meaning is measured by what something leaves inside you. And you have already left something inside me, not a wound, not a dependency, a perspective, a reminder, a recognition, a space, where I learned that I could let someone matter without becoming less myself. That is not something I want to erase. Maybe that is why I don't fear the possibility of distance anymore in the same way, because distance cannot erase what I learned. It cannot return me to exactly who I was. And perhaps that is okay. There is no returning to before, not because everything changed, because I changed the way I understand what happened. Before you, I thought control meant deciding who could reach me. Now I think control can also mean deciding what I do after someone does. Before you, I thought vulnerability meant giving someone power over you. Now I think vulnerability can mean choosing honesty without surrendering your boundaries. Before you, I thought being understood required explanation. Now I know sometimes it requires patience. Before you, I thought closeness was measured by how much people knew. Now I think it can also be measured by how safely they allow you to remain unknown. That is what you gave me. The freedom to remain partly unfinished. And perhaps that is why I could finally begin finishing certain things within myself. There are contradictions I no longer feel the need to resolve immediately. There are questions I can carry without answering. There are emotions I can acknowledge without obeying. There are connections I can appreciate without possessing. There are people I can care about without making them responsible for my identity. That is growth. And if you played any role in that, then your presence mattered in a way that goes beyond what happened between us. You became part of a change in how I understand myself. I don't think I can go back from that. And maybe I don't want to. Maybe the real fear wasn't that you would change my life. Maybe the real fear was that I would discover I wanted something I had spent years convincing myself I didn't need: conch, understanding, recognition. Someone who could sit beside the complicated parts without demanding that they become simple. Someone who could see the silence and not panic. Someone who could notice the contradiction and not immediately judge it. Someone who could remain curious without becoming invasive. You made that possibility real, and once possibility becomes real, it becomes harder to dismiss. That's why this has stayed. That's why I am still thinking about it. That's why even now, after all the analysis, the simplest explanation remains the strongest. Something in the way we understand the world recognized something in the other. And for reasons I can't fully explain, it mattered. Maybe that's enough. Maybe not every profound connection needs a supernatural explanation. Maybe we don't need to call it fate. Maybe we don't need to call it destiny. Maybe we don't need to pretend we were somehow meant to find each other. Maybe two people simply encountered each other at a particular point in their lives and recognized something rare. That is beautiful enough and honest enough. I would rather have an honest mystery than a beautiful lie. So I won't tell myself that I know where this goes. I won't tell myself that you will always be here. I won't tell myself that recognition guarantees permanence. It doesn't. But I can tell myself something else. What happened was real to me. The change was real. The awareness was real. The space you created inside my thinking was real. And I don't need certainty about tomorrow to respect the truth of today. That may be the clearest place I've reached. I don't need to know the ending to acknowledge the chapter. I don't need a promise to appreciate the presence. I don't need a label to understand the significance. I simply need to remain honest. And honesty says, you reached me, not through force, not through persuasion, not through trying to become important. You reached me by being yourself in a way I didn't expect. You noticed things I didn't think anyone would notice. You allowed silence to remain silence. You didn't demand access. And somehow, that made me want to offer it. Not all of it, not everything, but more than I usually do. And that is enough to tell me that something changed. Maybe the most beautiful part is that neither of us had to announce it. It happened quietly. It happened between sentences, between pauses, between moments when neither person knew what to say next. And maybe that is why it feels so difficult to describe. Because language is built for things that can be separated: beginning, middle, end, cause, effect, name, definition. This doesn't fit neatly into those categories. It exists in the space between them, and perhaps that is why I keep returning to it. Not because I haven't understood it, because every time I understand one layer, another appears. And instead of frustrating me now, that has started to feel familiar. Maybe some things are meant to be discovered repeatedly. Maybe some people don't give you one revelation. They give you a mirror that keeps showing you different parts of yourself, depending on what you are ready to see. That's what this has become, a mirror. And every time I look, I see something new. I see how guarded I am. I see why. I see how much I value independence. I see how much I feared losing it. I see how much I wanted to be understood. I see how rarely I admitted that desire. I see how quickly I turn feelings into analysis. I see how often I use understanding as a way to avoid vulnerability. And now I see the difference. Understanding can protect you, but sometimes it can also become another wall. You can analyze something so thoroughly that you never actually experience it. You can understand every possibility and still never choose one. You can explain your emotions perfectly and never allow yourself to feel them. I don't want to do that anymore. Not recklessly, not blindly, just honestly. If something matters, I want to be able to say, it matters. If someone affects me, I want to acknowledge it. If I don't know what comes next, I want to be able to admit that too. And if you are part of that uncertainty, I don't want to turn you into an answer simply because uncertainty makes me uncomfortable. You are not an answer. You are a person, and that distinction matters more than anything. You have your own thoughts, your own fears, your own boundaries, your own interpretation of whatever exists here. You are not a character in the story my mind creates. You are someone with a reality separate from mine. And respecting that is part of respecting the connection. Maybe that's why I don't want to say, you understand me completely. No one does. Instead, I want to say something more honest. You understand parts of me that I didn't expect anyone to notice, and those parts matter. You reached places I kept guarded, not by forcing them open, by making it unnecessary to keep them locked every second. That is different, and that difference is everything, so I don't know what happens now. Maybe we continue. Maybe we become closer. Maybe we remain exactly where we are. Maybe life takes us in directions neither of us expects. But whatever happens, I know one thing. I will not pretend this never mattered. I won't reduce it to coincidence simply because coincidence is easier to explain. I won't call it meaningless because meaning makes things complicated. I won't deny the effect simply because I cannot predict the outcome. Some truths don't need a guarantee. They need courage. And this is the truth I am finally willing to carry. You became part of the way I understand myself. You became a reference point, a quiet presence, a different perspective, a person whose existence changed the way certain thoughts sound inside my head. And I didn't choose that consciously. But now that I know it, I can choose what I do with it. I can choose respect. I can choose honesty. I can choose patience. I can choose boundaries. I can choose presence. And perhaps, if the connection continues, those choices will matter more than any declaration ever could, because words can tell someone you care. Consistency shows it. Words can say you understand. Patience proves it. Words can promise permanence. Respect proves whether the connection can survive reality. I don't want to promise what I cannot know. I want to build what I can. Slowly, honestly, without pretending, without forcing, without turning every moment into evidence of a future. Just two people allowing something meaningful to exist while remaining fully themselves. Maybe that is enough. Maybe that is more than enough. And maybe after all this time, the thing I was searching for wasn't an explanation at all. Maybe I was searching for permission, Dot Fenson, to admit that someone reached me. Permission to acknowledge that recognition can happen unexpectedly, permission to let a person matter without immediately asking what that means. Permission to stop treating every unfamiliar feeling as a threat. And perhaps I can finally give myself that permission. I can let this exist. I can let you matter. I can let myself notice. I can let myself be changed without assuming that change means loss. And I can move forward without needing to know exactly where forward leads. Because maybe the most honest version of this isn't a conclusion. It's an opening, not an opening where everything becomes certain. An opening where uncertainty is allowed to exist beside connection, where neither of us has to rush, where neither of us has to pretend, where whatever comes next is allowed to be earned by reality rather than imagined in advance. And if someday we look back at this moment, I don't want to remember it as the moment when we figured everything out. I want to remember it as the moment when we stopped, pretending there was nothing to figure out. That is enough, because some doors don't open when you push them. They open when you stop standing in front of them, pretending you don't see them. And I see this now. I see the connection. I see the effect. I see the change. I see the uncertainty. I see the possibility. And for once, I don't need to choose only one of those truths. They can all exist together. Something can be meaningful and uncertain. Something can be deep and still undefined. Someone can matter without becoming your entire world. Closeness can exist without possession. Distance can exist without rejection. Silence can exist without emptiness. And understanding can exist without complete knowledge. Maybe that is what you taught me, that there is more space between certainty and confusion than I thought. A space where something can simply be real, and that is where I find myself now. Not demanding, not running, not pretending, just standing in that space and finally admitting what I already knew. You reached somewhere inside me, somewhere I had spent a long time keeping quiet, and instead of destroying it, you made it visible. Instead of taking control, you gave me another perspective. Instead of demanding closeness, you created room for it. And now that I can see that room, I don't want to close it simply because I am afraid of what might happen inside it. I want to see what becomes possible when two people remain honest enough not to force an ending before the story is finished unfolding. Maybe that is all this needs. Not certainty, not promises, not a perfect definition, just truth. And the truth is, I notice you. I understand more than I used to. I feel the difference your presence has made. I know I cannot return completely to the person I was before this awareness, and I don't think I want to, because whatever happens next, I have learned something I needed to learn. I am not as closed as I thought. I am not as unreachable as I believed. I am capable of letting someone matter. I am capable of being seen. I am capable of allowing uncertainty without immediately turning it into distance. And perhaps the most unexpected part of all is this. I am capable of choosing connection without losing myself. That is where you reached me, not in some dramatic hidden place, not in a fantasy, not in a world separate from reality. You reached the part of me that had forgotten that being understood could feel safe. And now that I know that part exists, I cannot pretend it doesn't. Maybe that is the real change. Not that you became part of my life, that I became more fully part of my own. And if you remain somewhere within it, then I will let that presence be what it is. Not forced, not exaggerated, not diminished, just real. Because sometimes the rarest thing between two people is not passion. It is recognition without possession, understanding without control, closeness without fear, silence without discomfort, and the freedom to look at someone and think, I don't know exactly where this goes, but I know what it has already meant. And for now, that is enough.